Geography 507, Geography of the Global Economy, Module 12, Part 1. We're going to shift our focus to industry and industrialization at the periphery for the next few modules. We're going to begin with a discussion of the different trends in manufacturing value added. Now, this is the main way that we examine manufacturing activities, since products are not typically made in one place anymore, but instead are broken up through our flexible production system. We talked before about how during the Depression of the 30s, the global economy and international trade slowed down considerably, that we had protectionist measures put in place by more developed country national governments, and that following that, with the war and post-war, we saw the United States, followed by Europe and Japan, achieve economic growth through industry and through new manufacturing technologies and new materials. This is done without seriously using the periphery to boost our more developed country economies. Instead, it seemed to be related to industrial stimulation by the war, followed by the Marshall Plan and other investments in more developed countries by more developed countries. Leaving the periphery to languish, as they serve less of a role, really takes us to a point where the formal colonial era starts to fall apart. And in the 50s and 60s, and then picking up speed, we see a reduction in colonial importance. We see a reduction in core periphery trade. So less developed countries were basically left out of the strategies for economic growth that we see in more developed countries. Now, to react to that, in the 60s and 70s, the development strategies of many less developed countries tried to place emphasis on industry rather than on their primary commodity production. Industry is what had boosted the core, time and time again. Plus, pessimism about future prospects for primary products. Generally, that sector was seen to be economically backward compared to the manufacturing sector. So that led to a perspective, a government philosophy shared through a lot of the less developed or developing world. Now, in response, some less developed countries started on different development strategies. Now, the ones that have success had very strong government involvement, so it's not going to be private sector capitalism or free market, very strong government financial support. Many begin with import substitution strategies, producing the basics for yourself, and these are ones that are going to tend to also be more labor intensive. We see this then shift into the export strategies for these goods, and again, the thing that gives the advantage to our less developed countries is the very low labor cost. For some that are able to move farther, and ones we now label as our NICs, or newly industrializing countries, again, these have the characteristic of strong state involvement, big government activity. They move on to heavier industry production and import substitution for durable goods. And to give you an idea of the types of things they're pursuing, in a very few countries, we see concentration on iron and steel production, such as Brazil and South Korea, machinery production in the Asias, again, South Korea and China, industrial chemical production in places like India. We do see industrialization. We don't see it in a lot of places. So we have kind of a cloudy picture here. We have industrialization a little bit in Middle and South America, a little bit in the Middle East, a little bit in the Asias. At the same time, manufacturing value added has grown very slowly in all those regions, but also in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. Those are our troubled spots today. Now there's a tendency to assume, because we see so many labor-intensive, cheap items being exported to the core, that non-durable goods are the dominant production. And we know that isn't the whole picture. We said before about 10% of the durables, but about 50% of the non-durables come from LDCs. That's starting to shift. And it also shifts with change in multinational corporation investment strategies. They're obviously the bigger player in directing industrial development. Their strategies have shifted over this time period too. In the 60s and 70s, we see direct investment in our less developed countries by corporations, building whole branch plants or subsidiaries. And a lot of the focus then was build the whole item and sell it to the large domestic market. So it was really market expansion that was a key here. We know when we get to the 70s and the 80s, because of transportation and communication technologies and other things, we start to see indirect investment in LDCs because of more global sourcing. We see subcontracting, we see component production. We don't make the whole product, we take advantage of whatever it is that less developed country has to offer. Now this is the export market-oriented nature of non-durables. And we said before about 50% of our non-durables are coming out of less developed countries. Now those are cheap. There are some places, our newly industrializing countries, that have been able to break out of that. What have they done? Well, in the 70s and the 80s, at a time when we're seeing that global sourcing, in a few countries, they start to undertake massive borrowing. We're going to have strong government involvement. We're going to have unfair business practices. To give you an example, there'll be protectionist measures. There'll be certain business categories that are going to be subsidized by the government, while other categories will not. There is a complex plan in most places which provides unfair advantages to some industries, and then later that will shift once they're established to other industries. All this is different from what is being pursued in terms of a free market capitalist approach to the global economy. We have an export market orientation in both non-durables to start and durables to follow. And we get things like Hyundai coming out of South Korea. Now, in many less developed countries, not those few that make it to the NIC label, we have a similar but different set of strategies. In the 70s and the 80s, again, massive borrowing by governments. Here, a lot of money is spent on infrastructure investment, trying to attract our multinational corporations. So creating areas, small areas, that have high-tech shipping ports, that have internet opportunities, that have greater provision of utilities. This goes along with the export processing zone creation strategy in an attempt to attract some of that global sourcing. Here, the market orientation tends to be things that result from labor-intensive processes. Tend to be our non-durables, electronics, textiles, clothing, plus staples and basic commodities. So we have a real, I'd say, cloudy picture, mixed picture. Industrialization has definitely worked for some. We have the Asian tiger countries that have rapidly industrialized, but not through free market participation. We've seen less developed countries that seem to be worse off now than when they were colonies, perhaps because of direct free market participation. We have many that have tried to industrialize. We have many that have failed. This is even the case for simple export processing zone creation. So our picture is mixed. That makes it difficult to identify successful strategies that different countries could potentially follow.